Thank you for watching. The topic today is the law and the cross, seeing the gospel in the Pentateuch. Sometimes there's a tendency to view the division between the Old Testament and the New Testament as being so distinct that we almost view it as two separate gods representing the Old and New Testament, with the Old Testament God being vengeful and wrathful, but the New Testament God being one of love and mercy. But really, this is a misconception. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a misrepresentation that's reckless and irresponsible on our parts, if that is the message that we depict in dealing with the division in the Old and New Testaments. And really, if we see less of holiness at Calvary than Sinai, we have a terribly flawed understanding of Scripture. The reality is that Scripture paints one of the most beautiful, consistent portraits of an unchanging God from Genesis all the way to Revelation, one consistent message. And in this presentation, I would like to demonstrate just a few ways that we see the unity of the Scripture that can only be orchestrated by God by demonstrating specifically how the Pentateuch points toward Christ. This is not an exhaustive presentation. There's many other types that could have been covered, many other foreshadowings that could have been covered, but I'm just going to cover three small areas here. Going to cover seeing Christ in the fall, seeing Christ in the Exodus, and seeing Christ in the law itself. So as we look at the law, we realize you don't have to do an in-depth study on the types of Christ to see how the fall points toward the cross and the sacrifice that Jesus would make there. In Genesis chapter 3, we see the perfect relationship between God and man, that perfect fellowship being broken by man's rebellion and sin. It's been often noted that sinners must understand the bad news before they can hear the good news. So Genesis 3 lays the foundation of this bad news that can lead us to the gospel in John 3:16. No one can accept this cure without first understanding the disease, which is their sinful condition. We see this sinful condition demonstrated first here in Genesis chapter 3. But there is a type of Christ here as well. Herbert Lockyer points out in his book, All the Messianic Prophecies of the Bible, that Paul presents Adam as a type of Christ in both 1 Corinthians 15 and in Romans 5. Adam is the one man who brings sin and death into the world, but Christ is the one man who brings redemption and life into the world. So with the fall comes death. The book of Romans tells us the wages of sin is death. Many have noted the deaths of animals and God's subsequent coats of skin for Adam as the first presentation of blood sacrifice, which offer covering for man's shame. This is God showing us substitutionary atonement that would be a part of his redemptive plan throughout history. It seems reasonable to conclude that this action of God did set a precedent, as we see Abel offering blood sacrifices, which are accepted by God. So we move on to the Exodus. It's easy to see not only the progression of the story of God's covenant people, the Israelites, but also progression in his larger story of redemption for all mankind, with the signs increasingly pointing towards Christ and the ultimate sacrifice. At the end of the plagues in Egypt preceding the liberation of the Israelites, we see the celebration observance of the very first Passover. This was a historical event in which the firstborn male of every house was killed, with the only exception being those who had enough faith in God's command to kill that Passover lamb and to take that blood and apply it to the door of the house. So it's almost impossible for a New Testament believer to read this story, to hear this story talked about, without seeing the obvious foreshadowing of the security that we have through Christ's sacrifice and through his blood. And it's also significant that Christ will fulfill the Passover, with the New Testament telling us that Christ is our Passover, with his crucifixion and resurrection also closely coinciding with the observance of the Passover celebration there in first century Jerusalem. As we move on into the law, it can be easily demonstrated that the law itself, not just the 5 books of the law, but the law that was given to the Israelites there on Mount Sinai, mostly related in the books of Leviticus there through Deuteronomy. The law was intended, the New Testament tells us, to bring us to Christ. So the blood sacrifices that were required for fellowship with God testified of Christ's coming sacrifice, and the priesthood testified of the mediation that Christ would offer for all men. The writer of Hebrews shows us the superiority of Christ as our high priest in chapter 4, verses 14 and 15. And in chapter 9, verse 14, he speaks of the efficacy of Christ's blood for the cleansing of our souls from every sin we would ever commit. But it should once again be noted that types and shadows are not the only way the Pentateuch testifies of Christ. It clearly demonstrates the two fundamental truths of God's holiness and man's sinfulness. The continual call to holiness in light of and because of God's holiness is continually emphasized in the book of Leviticus. This great gulf between God's holiness and man's sinfulness testifies of the absolute necessity of a Redeemer for us all. Maybe this is the most profound way of all, that the Pentateuch and the Old Testament at large points us forward toward the sacrifice of Christ that he would make for our souls. Thank you for watching, and next time you feel maybe tempted to overlook the Old Testament and the first 5 books in particular, maybe you can think about something that we've said here and realize that we can see Christ in the Old Testament. Thank you for watching.